Hello, everyone, and welcome to Women's Sex-Based Rights Grassroots Global Women Voices, a special webinar organized by Women's Declaration International in the context of the NGO CSW66 Forum, that is, the civil society side of the 66th UN Commission on the Status of Women, CSW, which runs parallel to the official session taking place at the UN headquarters. Women's Declaration International, or WDI, is the leading global organization defending women's sex-based rights against the threats posed by gender identity ideology. We are a volunteer women group from across the globe dedicated to protecting women's sex-based rights. We have over 100 volunteer activists, including 53 country contacts, engaged in defending women's sex-based rights. Our volunteers include academics, writers, organizers, activists, health practitioners, and aim to represent the total breadth of the human female experience. Our main tool for activism is the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights, a document based on international human rights instruments with a special focus on the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, an international treaty adopted in 1979 by the United Nations General Assembly. The declaration was created by the founders of WDI to lobby nations to maintain language protecting women and girls on the basis of sex rather than gender or gender identity, as it is specified in those legal instruments, since we cannot lose sight of the fact that international human rights law lays down obligations which states are bound to respect. The declaration argues that the definition of woman should be sex-based, and therefore that men who claim to have a female gender identity should not be included in the category women in the context of women's rights. The declaration was presented in New York in March 2019, that is 3 years ago, also in the context of the CSW. And since then, it has been signed by more than 30,000 people and 400 organizations from 157 countries. We invite you to read the declaration and sign it on our website, www.womensdeclaration.com. In today's webinar, we're going to hear from women all over the world who are going to delve into the meaning of different articles of our declaration. We'll have Graziella Florimond from France, who will tell us how women's rights are based on sex. It's a presentation on Article 1 of the Declaration. Then we will have Lecuona from Mexico, who will present language and the current backlash against women's rights to freedom of opinion and of expression, a presentation based on the Article 4 of the Declaration. Next, we will hear from a member of WDI China who has asked us to keep her intervention anonymous for her safety, and who will explain us how violence against women is sex-based. That's related to the Article 8 of the Declaration. Then we will have Rochelle Dien from Bahamas, who will tell us about reaffirming the need for the protection of the rights of the child, training and continuing professional development programs that align with best interest of the child. That's a presentation based on the Article 9 of the Declaration. Our final speaker will be Sheila Jeffries from the UK, with a general overview of the current situation. Can women's rights as human rights survive? So now we're going to hear from our first speaker, Graziella Florimond, a femalist who advocates against the erosion of women's rights in France with WDI France. And she will present us the Article 1 of the Declaration, Women's Rights are based on sex. Thank you, Graziella, for being here, and over to you.
I would like to talk about Article 1, reaffirming that the rights of women are based upon the category of sex. States should maintain the centrality of the category of sex and not gender identity in relation to women's and girls' rights to be free from discrimination. Gender identity is destroying our rights when states put that word in their law. Gender identity is destroying our rights because it's denying the reality of sex. The problem is that people who are denying the reality of sex are also denying the reality of sex. You know, that's light. But to understand what they are thinking, you just have to read the real definition you can find on Yogyatra principle. We have to read this text because this text contains all we have to know. We need to know about what they want to do with our rights. Gender identity. This is an individual experience of gender. We may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of the body, which may involve, if freely chosen, modification of bodily appearance or function by medical, surgical, or other meaning, and other expression of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerism. This is the definition of gender identity. But if you understood what I said, maybe it's because I read very bad, because it's not made to be understood. Let's focus on the part which is denying the reality of sex. Sex assigned at birth. At birth means we live in middle age and nobody can use ecography to check the sex of a baby before birth. It's denying the reality of progress in medicine. Second, people who use surrogacy or who need to have external fecundation can choose the sex of the baby. They put some mark on male sperm or on female sperm, and they can choose their embryo based on the sex. 3 days after the conception. 3 days after the conception, you have no genital to observe, but you can choose the sex of your baby. At birth is a lie. Nobody checked the sex of a baby at birth. You can check it a long time ago. Assign. Assign means people give you something like that in an arbitrary way because it was not there before. Sex in biology for any life being means you can produce gametes. If you are part of a species which can produce gametes, you have a sex. And nobody can impose you like that at birth. It's written in each cell of our body. If you produce small gametes, you are male, small gametes of sperm. If you produce large gametes, that means eggs, you are female. And if your body don't work, if your genital, your reproductive system don't work, that changes nothing about what you are. A sterile woman is still a woman because a motorbike with no gas is still a motorbike. So gender identity is based on a lie about biology, on a lie about progressive medicine. And by erasing the reality of sex, they are erasing our rights, because our rights are based on sex, because it's women with the same sex who fought the right to vote, and women with the same sex who fought to have the right to get abortion. Second, Article 1, particular in the political, social, economic, and cultural field, all appropriate measures, including legislation, to ensure the full development and advancement of women, of the purpose of guaranteeing them the exercise and enjoyment of human rights and fundamental freedom. Is it possible to say our right, we have the right to enjoy our body and especially our genitals? Our genitals have two purposes: reproduction, sexuality, and disposal of body waste. Excuse me for my English, we pull out dejection on NP. By denying the reality of sex and by making promise of happily ever after with top and bottom surgery or medics, people are destroying our ability to enjoy our body. Reproduction means you can produce gametes to reproduce. Cross-sex hormone kills gametes, not immediately, but with years, you become sterile. Sexuality means we can share, give, and receive pleasure, but top and bottom surgery destroy our ability of body to feel pleasure. Not all of part, but if you can watch some picture of a teen girl, they are teen girl without tits. It's because when they are made bottom surgery, keep the tits needs more intervention, so it's more expensive. So people choose to have no tits with top surgery. but it is an erogenous zone. You lost ability to have pleasure there. Second, to create new penises, they have to take part of forearm of tight. You can see it on the picture and the cover of New York Times. Did you have orgasm? You have no erection, no ejaculation too, and you lost ability to have orgasm too. And the worst part about dejection and pee, we have to remember men and women don't pee the same, and our urethra have not the same localization. When they made bottom surgery, they have to change the place of the urethra, and sometimes surgeons mess up and urethra have some hole. So the pee, instead of out, stay in the body. So some people have a lot of complication because of bottom surgery. And you can see the picture of a trans-identified female who witnessed in a documentary and said that because of bottom surgery, she had to wear a colostomy bag because she can poop normally. Why people leave that? Because other people promise them, you will affirm your gender, you will cure your gender dysphoria, you will have happily ever after life because you are your true self. Seriously, with a lot, you can have child, you can enjoy your sexuality, you can even pee and poop normally. Where is health? Our rights are based on sex, because with our sex, we can enjoy our body. Article 1, Part D. States should ensure that the word woman, the word girl, and the terms traditionally used to refer to women's body part and bodily function on the basis of sex continue to be those used in constitutional acts, legislation, in the provision of service, and in policy documents when referring to persons of the female sex. I will use my race card just 1 minute. When I was a little girl, a dumb little white boy said to me, "Oh, my ancestors were human beings, your ancestors were monkeys." For real. Then he asked me, "Do you want to become my girlfriend?" I felt slurred, I felt demonized, and I was angry. Of course, I said him no, but he slurred me before to ask me to go out with him. I have the same feeling when I listen to people call us people with vagina who menstruate and possess an uterus and fallopian tube and can produce cervical mucus and use its chest to give milk to its child. Because this vocabulary is available for any female mammal on Earth. Any female mammals have an uterus, a vagina, can produce a cervical mucus, and can give milk to their baby with their chest. Cow, sow, female monkey, they have the right to keep their species name, but we have to erase our human being name from our human being life? I don't think so. We are female human being, and female human beings have a human being name, woman or girl, that's all. And we owe nothing to people who slur us. They are acting like this dumb, sadistic little white boy who said to me, "Yes, you come from monkeys, please go out with me." And before I conclude, I would like to share with you a femalist prayer I wrote, because I think that feminism is our future. And this is the text is, "Little sister, remember, you are perfect and you don't need to be pretty or feminine for that. You have the right to love who you want, how you want, the right to not love too, and nobody has the right to despise you, slur you, threat you, or harm you because of that. You have the right to be selfish. You have the right to be vulnerable. You have the right to think about your comfort and your body first. You have the right to say no. You have the right to say no to who you want, for whatever reason you want, in whatever way you want, whenever you want. And nobody have the right to blame you, to insult you, to burn you alive because of that. Our body are like our Mother Earth. Our body are gifts. They are female planet, unique, irreplaceable, and beautiful. And I would like so much we could learn to love her and celebrate her for that. Because, dear sister, you are perfect, and you don't need to be pretty or feminine for that. Our right is based on our sex, and we deserve respect and the respect of our rights.
So now we are moving on to our next speaker, who is Laura Lecuona from Mexico. Laura has a degree in philosophy. She's an editor and translator, and she's also a feminism communicator. She's a country contact for the Women's Declaration International Mexico's chapter. And as I said before, she will present language and the current backlash against women's rights to freedom of opinion and of expression, which is related to the Article 4 of the Declaration. Over to you, Laura.
I'm going to talk about the Article 4 of the Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights. This article reaffirms women's rights to freedom of opinion and freedom of expression and reads as follows. A, states should ensure that women have the right to hold opinions without interference. This should include the right to hold and express opinions about gender identity without being subject to harassment, persecution, or punishment. B, states should uphold women's right to freedom of expression, including the freedom to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas of all kinds, regardless of frontiers, either orally, in writing, or in print, in the form of art, or through any other media. This should include the freedom to communicate ideas about gender identity without being subject to harassment, persecution, or punishment. C, states should uphold the right of everyone to describe others on the basis of their sex rather than their gender identity in all contexts. States should recognize that attempts by state agencies, public bodies, and private organizations to compel individuals to use terms related to gender identity rather than sex are a form of discrimination against women and shall take measures to eliminate this form of discrimination. And finally, D, states should prohibit any form of sanctioning, prosecution, or punishment of persons who reject attempts to compel them to identify others on the basis of gender identity rather than sex. All over the world, women are being harassed, prosecuted, and punished for holding, let alone publicly stating, the view that men cannot be women, women don't have penises, and there is not such thing as a gender identity. That is, we don't have gendered souls. Our tastes, personalities, abilities, and inclinations don't have anything to do with us being men or women. These demonized women know that gender is just another word for sexist stereotypes. And of course, these women, we don't see anything positive in the attempts to replace, quote, the category of sex, which is biological, with the language of gender, which refers to stereotyped sex roles in United Nations documents, strategies, and actions, because this has led to confusion, which ultimately risks undermining the protection of women's human rights. We, these demonized women, are very worried indeed. Now, this talk of gender identity is everywhere, and you see people, even women, celebrating the undermining of women's rights in the name of feminism. How have we got here? How have women, media, and the institutions come to be so amazingly captured by these ideas? By various kinds of strategies. Money plays a huge part in it, of course. Also, emotional blackmail is a very effective weapon. And through language, bit by bit. First, they tell you, use their preferred pronouns. How difficult can it be? If you don't use their preferred pronouns, they might be triggered. Be kind. And then you cave in. You gently start calling some men she, and in gender languages, as in Spanish, start referring to them in the feminine form, just to be nice. When some of those men commit crimes, because that's not an unusual thing for a man to do, the newspapers say, she raped, she killed, she had a huge collection of child pornography. She. The female crime statistics start rocketing as if by magic. Sometimes we know those rapists, killers, and child abusers are not women at all, only because of the photograph accompanying the text. Sometimes we just have to guess because this tiny bit of information, just a small detail, is hidden from public view, because it would be rude to imply that this rapist, killer, or child abuser was a man. We have to be kind to him. Then, when those rapists you called she are convicted, they prefer to be in a female prison. Of course they do. So we don't only use their preferred pronouns, we let them go into their preferred facilities. Some men like sports, but are not so good at them. So they start saying they identify as women, asking the rest of the world to call them she, and the world complies. Then they start competing in the female categories. That's what they prefer. Oh, they are so much more comfortable there. They not only win the medals and break records, they also get to be naked among naked women who didn't consent and weren't asked. And you say, oh, she's such a marvelous young woman. She has broken all world records in her category. How superior she is. But see those people over there? They are mean. They say she's a male. How dare they? But by now, maybe you have managed to believe it yourself. He's a woman with a penis. You started playing the pronouns game, and now you can't even notice that we are talking about a male, who, by the way, is a cheat, and from the moment he went in the women's locker room, an abuser. If you hadn't allowed this language to enter into your mind and your vocabulary, it would be much easier for you to see what is really happening and to get angry and act accordingly. Your docility and kindness took you to an awkward place. You are marvelously deceiving yourself. The self-deception you engaged in was made possible by language, starting with pronouns, these tiny harmless words, those 3 or 4 letters, she, her. How hard could it be calling him she? And now pronouns are interfering with your ability to think clearly. Pronouns are constraining your thought. The pronouns game comes in a package, along with a series of rules and weird ideas. You also have to believe sex is assigned at birth, sex is a social construct, men are women if they say so, men can have periods and get pregnant. Some teenage girls have to take testosterone and have a double mastectomy in order to find their true selves. You have to believe this. Maybe it all starts as a make-believe belief. Maybe initially you don't really think a man who says he is a woman is literally one. Here's how it goes. A man says he believes he's a woman, he feels like a woman. Then a woman must automatically believe that he literally is a woman. And this woman makes her feminism about defending the presumed right of that man to impose his inner belief to the rest of the world. But does this arise from a firm belief that they are women, or from a very feminine desire to be accepted by them, by society? Thanks to the pronoun game and the gaslighting and deception that go with it, you don't see, as we do, men invading feminism and women's spaces. You see fragile and oppressed women suffering exclusion and discrimination. But we are looking at the exact same men engaging in the very same actions. What changed? Why are our views so different? You wanted to believe they were women. You managed to convince yourself you believed it. And now, sometimes you act as if you really believed it. Some of your actions are compatible with the belief that they are women. Nevertheless, some other actions betray you and bring to light what you really think. Because if you truly believed they are women, are you sure you would be so obedient and complying and submissive. I've seen women who are naturally afraid of predatory men and who don't want men in feminist protests, melting and relinquishing if the man in question says he feels like a woman on the inside. So their defense mechanisms magically disappear because of this belief in the man's head, which she now believes she has the duty to hold. Otherwise, she's a bad person. As he believes it, now she necessarily has to believe it too. There's a man in front of you. He wants to enter your female-only space, say your lesbian book club. You say, no way. And then he says, but I'm a woman. In fact, I'm a lesbian. I have a female gender identity and I'm attracted to women, so I'm a lesbian. You say, I'm awfully sorry for my mistake. You are welcome, sister. Now, please tell us, what should we read next? Everything is different now due to the sole fact of him saying, I'm a woman. What magical properties does this statement possess coming from a man? And do you notice? You yourself see a man unless he tells you otherwise. You don't believe your own reasoning. You needed him to tell you what you yourself were seeing with your own eyes. Furthermore, because he told you he is a woman, you decided that he belonged in a lesbian space without asking your lesbian so-called sisters. You put him above all of them. Why? Just because you don't want to be called a gatekeeper? I even see feminists who call themselves gender critical, who sometimes even call themselves radical feminists. So women who know men can't be women and there's no such thing as a gender identity, indulging some men and using their preferred pronouns. Out of kindness and fear, many women are letting our hard-won sex-based rights slip away. Told to be kind, many women are playing the dangerous pronoun game. Out of kindness and fear, many are accepting uncritically such which were foreign to them until some males told them, you have to believe this. Out of kindness and fear, they are allowing others to tell them how to think, what to believe. If you use their language and engage in their language games, you are abiding by their rules, that is, men's rules. You are letting them win. You are giving them an extraordinary power over your mind, your ideas, your opinions, your actions, and over the lives of other women. Please don't.
We are now going to hear from a lesbian feminist from WDI China, who, as I explained earlier, she prefers to remain anonymous. She will talk about how violence against women is sex-based, a presentation that is related to the Article 8 of the Declaration. So thank you, sister, for your bravery in speaking up and in joining us. Over to you.
As someone who grew up in China and has access to Western media, I'm aware of China's authoritarian reputation in the West. The clampdown on free speeches is undeniably real. For example, in April of last year, the Chinese authorities closed more than a dozen radical feminist groups from a popular social networking website called Douban. The government also banned the keyword 6B4T, which refers to a feminist view from South Korea that advocates women to shun heterosexual relationships and childbearing. I'll quote Genevieve Gluck's piece on this incident. The reason for the removal of the radical feminist groups on Douban is not explicitly stated, but it is suggested that the ideas discussed in the forums violated national policies. The Twitter account Free Chinese Feminists shared a screenshot of a notification from Douban, which told administrators of the banned groups that the forums contained extremism, radical politics, and ideologies. The uncompromising anti-marriage, anti-sex, and anti-birthing views asserted in the groups contradict government measures aimed at elevating current declining birth rates, now at their lowest since 1949. Like internet censorship and mass surveillance, another issue that people often bring up when talking about their impression of China is its one-child policy. Here arises a great and enduring myth. That is, China's one-child policy has brought about the country's sex imbalance. For instance, an article on Washington Post says, out of China's population of 1.4 billion, there are nearly 34 million more males than females, the equivalent of almost the entire population of California or Poland, who will never find wives and only rarely have sex. China's official one-child policy, in effect from 1979 to 2015, was a huge factor in creating this imbalance, as millions of couples were determined that their child should be a son. Such imputation, in my opinion, assigns sole blame to the one-child policy, while ignoring China's long record of female infanticide. Indeed, many Chinese feminists believe that the popular narrative of about China's sex imbalance portrays a severely skewed sex ratio as a result of policy mistake made by the Chinese government, rather than an age-old phenomenon caused by a specific form of violence against women, female infanticide, which predates the one-child policy. What appears to be the earliest reference to female infanticide is this record in the Hanfeizi, which is a Chinese text that dates from 230 BC. Moreover, parents' attitude to children is such that when they bear a son, they congratulate each other, but when they bear a daughter, they kill her. The family instructions for the Yan clan provides evidence for the custom being practiced, even in the families of high officials during the northern and the southern dynasties. I have a distant relative who has many concubines. When the birth is near, he sends servants to keep watch, and when the labor begins, they peep into the room from outside of the window or the door. If a girl is born, she is immediately taken or killed. The mother cries, but no one dares save the baby girl. In Neo-Confucian circles during the 11th century, the concept of exalting men and despising women was embraced more fully than ever, nor was it confined to a scholar official class. Living in exile in a village, the poet Su Shi learned that infanticide was practiced in a district and wrote to the chief magistrate. The poor farmers, as a rule, raised only 2 sons and 1 daughter and killed babies beyond this number. They especially disliked to raise daughters, with the result that there are more men than women and many bachelors in the country. A baby is often killed at birth by drowning in cold water. It dies after crying a short moment. Based on an investigation made in 1936 of a village about 80 miles west of Shanghai, Fei Xiaotong noted that in a census of a village taken in 1935, the ratio of females in the age group 0 to 5 was unusually low, 87 girls to 118 boys. Moreover, only in 131 families, or 37% of the total, were there girls under 16 among their children, and in only 14 families was there more than 1 girl. Some Westerners who carried out field studies in China during the 1920s and 1930s discovered that the number of males exceeded the number of females, but did not put this down to female infanticide. John Lassenbach concluded from his study that in both North and South China, the resident rural population was characterized by a large proportion of males. He arrived at an overall ratio of 108 males per 100 females, finding even fewer females than males at ages under 20. For example, for North China, he tabled 112 male births per 100 female. For South China, 113 male births per 100 female. The reasons he gave for this disparity were under-enumeration of females and a higher mortality rate among young females. While carrying out field work in China in 1935 to 37, Olga Long heard of many cases of female infanticide from both Chinese and Western observers, and the hospital records she used for her study contained matter-of-fact references to infanticide made by Chinese social medical workers. If Long's figures are to be believed, there were more girls than boys in the under 5 age group, and the real discrepancy between males and females began to appear in the 5 to 9 age group. How can this be explained? They probably reveal the preferential treatment of sons, resulting in indirect female infanticide. Even when baby daughters were not killed at birth, they had less chance of surviving the infant years because of differential treatment of children. In poor families where there was only a small amount of food available, sons were often given a larger share, and the frequent epidemics took a heavier toll of girls than of boys. Indirect female infanticide was a characteristic common to all periods of Chinese history. One would think that with China's current economic success, the practice of female infanticide has come to an end. Indeed, sex-selective abortion is taking the place of female infanticide as a main cause of China's sex imbalance, but female infanticide persists. A well-known practice is inserting sewing needles into infant girls' bodies. A superstition in China is that pushing needles into a girl's body can scare away a female spirit, preventing her from reincarnating as a family's child. Some victims were unaware that needles are implanted in their bodies until they are adults. Women have reported finding dozens of sewing needles embedded in their bodies, some which had pierced vital organs. In one case, 23 needles were discovered in a woman's brain and torso, making the X-rays look like a dartboard. Doctors believe the needles were driven into the woman's body when she was days old. One in the top of her skull could only have been stuck there when the bones in her head were still soft. The hospital said they wanted her dead. The fact she is still alive is a medical miracle. Today, Chinese men outnumber women by more than 34 million. An international industry of bride trafficking has developed. Women and girls are abducted from neighboring countries, bought from family members, or lured with promises of work. Chinese men buy these women and girls, imprison, rape, and forcibly impregnate them. The victims include underage girls. They may also be sold into the sex trafficking industry. A study estimated that about 21,000 women and girls from northern Myanmar were forced into marriage in just one province in China from 2013 to 2017. A 2019 Human Rights Watch investigation identified victims from Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Pakistan, Nepal, and Vietnam. For Chinese women, trafficking of women and girls in broad daylight is not an urban legend. We're all aware that it's been going on, and we've learned to keep our distance from strangers on the street. However, the public's concern over bride trafficking has just recently erupted. Since January, a video has been everywhere on the Chinese internet. A middle-aged woman standing in a doorless brick shack, a dazed expression on her face, wearing no coat though it was the middle of winter. Around her neck was a metal chain, shackling her to the wall. The brief clip, posted by a blogger on Douyin, China's version of TikTok, raised many questions, and the social media users demanded answers. Who was she? Why was she locked up? And under what circumstances had she given birth to 8 children living in the house next door who said she was their mother? The top 3 hashtags about the chained woman on the Twitter-like social media platform Weibo have accumulated more than 10 billion views, and the topic continues to hold people's attention online amid Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The public learned that China's legal system was set up to protect the men who pay for abducted women. Buying a woman could subject someone to up to 3 years of jail time, the same as a sentence for buying 20 frogs. When victims of human trafficking filed for divorce, the courts often ruled against them, saying that having stayed with a man sufficed as evidence of a good marriage. The public learned how easily women, even well-educated ones, could become victims of human trafficking. A graduate student from Shanghai was abducted on a field trip and sold to a hunched man. She was rescued after 71 days. A 13-year-old girl in Beijing was kidnapped on her way to school and sold to a man who constantly beat her up. She had a son at 15 and couldn't escape until she turned 19. A young woman from Hangzhou was abducted on a business trip and spent the next 2 decades in a remote village. She was rescued after her son went to college and informed her parents. But the vast majority of human trafficking victims came from the poorest corners in China. Few were rescued. It was nearly impossible for the women to escape because those villages kept an eye on them. They would be beaten and locked up after being caught. The man who had chained that woman was charged only with abuse, instead of rape and false imprisonment. 2 women who tried to visit the chained woman were detained and beaten by local police officers in February. Their posts and social media accounts were deleted. Some social media users who shared their posts said they had gotten calls from the police. In China, gathering data and compiling statistics on violence against women is extremely difficult. On the one hand, under present Chinese law, marital rape is neither a criminal nor a civil infraction. The censorship, on the other hand, prevents women from recording statistics on violence against women and girls. On November 21st, 2020, screenshots and links to a GitHub repository called The Evils of Chinese Men were shared to Weibo and soon went viral. The repository, which shows updates going back 11 months, features news on violence against women and girls in China, with more than 1,800 entries sorted into 22 categories. The items include intimate partner violence, sexual assault, sexual harassment, and more. It also includes links to unjust court judgments since 2015. The entries are sometimes accompanied by commentary or quotes. The first category of intimate partner violence has a subtitle, "Not like I was hitting anyone else, she is my wife." Attached to 75 entries on intrafamilial sexual assault, "Not like I was doing it to anyone else, she is my daughter." Both comments are variations of a quote from a boy who murdered his mother in 2018 when he was 12 and told his uncle, "Not like I killed anyone else, she is my mom." The case that inspired the first variation was a man from Sichuan who brutally beat his wife in public while drunk, and when confronted by police, responded, "What? Hitting my own wife is illegal?" The second variation comes from the case of father from Guangdong who raped his then 12-year-old daughter and said, "She's my own kid. I just want to fool her around a bit. I couldn't help it." The author of the project is listed as all surviving Chinese women. The end note reads, "In this corrupt East Asian culture, women's lives are cheap as flies. If we ignore what's happening before us, the world will never become better. We cannot stay silent. We will not live blindly." Chen Zhizhi was the first to draw attention to the project on social media, but her post about the repository was deleted after it had accumulated more than 1,000 shares. In her post on November 21st, she urged people to save the link and the screenshots in case it is censored again. When I went to access this GitHub repository earlier this year, I discovered that the creator had taken it down. Fortunately, the Wayback Machine allows us to access the archive webpage. However, this also means the author will no longer update the repository. One Chinese lesbian feminist I knew once asked, "Would those millions of Chinese girls have been spared from being aborted and killed if they identified as boys?" The answer is obviously no, and the question can be extrapolated further. For example, if a girl had identified as a boy, would she have gotten away from being raped by her stepfather? Or, if a woman had identified as a man, could she have avoided being trafficked and chained? The violence against women and girls is sex-based. This is exactly why Article 8 of Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights is so crucial. To suggest that millions of women could have survived by claiming a gender identity is ridiculous. To say that a man who claims to have whatever gender identity poses no threat to women is equally absurd and insulting. In China, the subjugation of the female sex by the male sex is a sensitive topic that the state is trying to downplay. We lack statistics and have trouble documenting the male violence against women and girls, although it's a pronounced characteristic throughout Chinese history. It would be a shame if the West follows suit by obscuring the success of the victims and offenders due to ideology.
Now we are going to move on from Asia to the Caribbean. We are going to hear from Rochelle Dean from Bahamas. She's a civil society expert, academic, and she's also a country contact for the Women's Declaration International Bahamas chapter. Her talk is called "Reaffirming the Need for the Protection of the Rights of the Child, Training and Continuing Professional Development Programs that Align with the Best Interests of the Child." That is related to the Article 9 of the Declaration. Thank you very much, Rochelle, for being here, and over to you.
So this morning, I'm going to talk about Article 9 of the WDI Declaration, which is reaffirming the need for the protection of the rights of the child, specifically training and continuing professional development programs that align with the best interest of the child. Socially, the focus has been on the diversification issue instead of preparing the citizenry on how they can influence this concept within the democratic process. And so as we begin, we will speak to subtitle H and subtitle I of Article 9 of the Declaration, which reads, States should ensure inclusion in teacher training and continuing professional development programs of accurate material about human biology and reproduction and information about the human rights of people of diverse sexual orientations, which should include the challenging of sex stereotypes and of homophobia. And subtitle I states, agree that the education of the child shall be directed to the preparation of the child for a responsible life in a free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, and equality of sexes. This aligns with UNCRC Article 29. This should include measures to ensure that organizations are not allocated state funding to promote sex stereotyping and the concept of gender identity in educational institutions, as this constitutes the promotion of discrimination against women and girls. In order for this to be achieved, teachers should be trained and continuing development programs should exist. And this should include human rights of people of diverse sexual orientation, which should challenge sex stereotypes and homophobia. This will allow for teachers to be able to provide accurate, evolving material about human biology and reproduction, while also promoting human rights and preparing the child for socialization. The UN Committee on the Rights of the Child 2005 stated that the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child 2005 highlights the importance of children's rights for young children and argues that governments should adopt a positive agenda for early childhood education and shift away from traditional beliefs, viewing early childhood as a time for socialization and urging recognition and respect for children as social actors. Early conceptualization of children's rights tend to focus on welfare, but more recently, children's agency and participation rights have been emphasized. Participation articles refer to children's civil and political rights to a name and an identity, to be consulted on matters that affect them, to have access to information, to express their views, and take part in decisions. Training allows for teachers to make better decisions and allow for this type of environment that is open and respectful, while allowing children to be heard within the context that is applicable to their level of understanding. And so I think that's very important here, that we recognize that it's all about children being able to understand what it is that they are being taught, and that comes with more training. I think it's also important that we recognize that this policy agenda by the United Nations Committee should be taken with caution. Young children may not be able to properly perceive the intricacies of matters pertaining to sexual orientation and should not be introduced to such ideologies until it is age appropriate in order for them to be able to conceptualize a positive body image and duality. The efficacy of puberty for children then becomes a pivotal part of young adulthood, where a child then develops curiosity in terms of their body changes, sexual orientation, and gender expression. Governments have people spinning like a top, especially children, if we decide that we are going to have specific policies be introduced to them at an early childhood level. And so this is something that we really should take into consideration. Curricula should be consistent, essentially with the development of the child, which is more important than the social aspects that are usually guided by parents. I think this policy is specifically stating children are now going to be able to be controlled by the government. That is 100% erroneous, and that is wrong. Parents are supposed to guide children and not the government. And what this policy is doing is stating that children then become subject to what the government wants them to do. And this certainly does facilitate gender dysphoria. And so certainly there should be more training that applies to children in order to make sure that they are protected. According to article subtitle I, states agree again that education shall be directed to the preparation of the child for responsible life in free society in the spirit of understanding, peace, tolerance, and equality of the sexes. This includes denying funding to promote sex stereotyping and the concept of of gender identity. And so training programs should meet these specific targets that teachers can understand relative to Article 9, as well as prejudicial attitudes. Training and other professional development courses will assist teachers in their ability to understand such curricula. Governments should be cautious to consider age appropriateness when considering culture shifts that are important to the social architecture that influences social behaviors, and is also the key determination of the specific policies that they will implement. And if we look at Article 29 of UNCRC, it says that a child's or young person's education should help their mind, body, and talents be the best they can. It should also build their respect for other people and the world around them. In particular, they should learn to respect their rights and the rights of others, their freedoms and the freedoms of others, their parents, the identity, language, and values of countries, including their own, and education should prepare children and young people for a responsible life in a free society. It should teach them how to live in an understanding and tolerant way that is nonviolent and that respects the environment. The recognition of the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child 2005 recommendation, the WDI Declaration would allow for teachers to be able to facilitate respect of children for themselves as well as others, tolerance, diversity, whilst also teaching respect of parents. So there are many interlinkages that are interlinkages to Article 9 as well as CRC. While Article 9 of the WDI Declaration speaks to CRC, Article 29 specifically, we can see the interlinkages of UNCRC Article 31 and Article 42. States parties recognize the right of the child to rest and leisure, to engage in play and recreational activities appropriate to the age of the child, and to participate freely in cultural life and the arts. 2, states parties shall respect and promote the right of the child to participate fully in cultural and artistic life, and shall encourage the provision of appropriate and equal opportunities for cultural, artistic, recreational, and leisure activity, which speaks to UNCRC Article 36. States parties shall protect the child against all other forms of exploitation prejudicial to any aspects of the child's welfare. And this also aligns specifically with WDI Article 9 that addresses the need for training and other professional development courses that will assist teachers to be able to properly defend and even challenge policy decisions that directly impact the rights of the child and that may dismiss the rights of parents. And finally, in doing so, this aligns with UNCRC Article 42, where state parties undertake to make the principles and provisions of the convention widely known by appropriate and active means to adults and children alike. I think it's very important that we recognize the word appropriate here. And so when there is a recommendation made and that specific recommendation comes out of a specific convention, we have to remember that we have to look at those specific subtitles and decide whether or not that recommendation makes sense and is applicable to that specific convention. And we see here where the UN committee, CRC committee, made a recommendation, but they didn't specifically address age appropriateness. And that's something that we have to take very seriously. And so when we look at what's happening all over the world, if we don't properly train individuals and make sure that teachers do have access to information that continues to evolve, then we can't really challenge some of the questions and some of the whys as it relates to some of these policies that are being made. A lot of them are erroneous. And at the end of the day, it seems as though they are pushing a specific agenda. And that is very important because, again, if teachers aren't prepared, aren't trained, and we limit professional development programs, then what will happen is we continue to pass the buck and we continue to miss those signs, and these policies will be passed into law, legislated, and at the end of the day, women and children will be discriminated against. And so elements of the Convention CRC and some recommendations are recognized and aligned with the WDI Article 9 and its pragmatic approach to training of teachers to achieve this goal, while redirecting stereotyping and the concept of gender ideology in educational institutions, which promote an invisible bias that goes against conscious values. Also, the idea that respect for parents is the guidance tool that allows children to participate in a free society with respect of others. And I think this is very important as we go forward. We have to make sure that children are aware, but more so, individuals have to be trained, and that funding should be allocated to make sure that teachers are able to challenge and individuals are able to say, hey, this doesn't make any sense to me. Why would we do that? It's very important that we do that. And that's something that the WDI declaration does. And in signing that, you're saying that you agree that individuals should also continue to have that training and continue to promote programs that do give them the information that they do need. The Bahamas specifically recently has had one of our ministers, he spoke out specifically, he was a former attorney general, and he spoke out relative to training as well as diversification and wanting to include diversity into the education, into our educational institutions, more so the the public schools, I'm sorry. But I think it's important that we remember that teachers have to be trained, because then they can challenge specific policies. And it's not so much about pushing a certain agenda. I think it's important that women are able to say, this doesn't make sense. Should we include age appropriateness into this? Why should a child have to know about sexual orientation at an early childhood to foster socialization? That's not socialization. That's kind of saying that a child then becomes subject to the government. The government sets the standard as to what is socially appropriate because they make the laws. And so I think it's very important that we recognize that we should protect our children as we go forward. And again, this is some of the interlinkages that the WDI declaration presents, and it definitely does align with UNCRC.
Now we are going to our final speaker, which is our very own Sheila Jeffries. Sheila Jeffries, she's a lesbian feminist activist, author and academic. She became an active feminist in 1973 in the UK and moved to the University of Melbourne in Australia in 1991, when she taught sexual politics, and back to the UK on retirement in 2015. She has written 11 books on the history and politics of sexuality, the most recent being an autobiography, Trigger Warning, in 2020. And she also is a director of WDI. Welcome, Sheila. Thank you for being here. And she's going to tell us about, she's going to have a general overview on the current situation. Her presentation is called Can Women's Rights as Human Rights Survive? Thank you again, and over to you, Sheila.
In fact, I'm going to talk about not just can women's rights as human rights survive, but can human rights survive as a concept, what is happening now in the name of gender identity. I'm going to argue that the inclusion of imagined identities, such as gender identity, into human rights understandings and activism threatens the significance and integrity of the very idea of human rights. The Declaration on Women's Sex-Based Rights that we are here to talk about today concerns the protection of women's rights from gender identity. The word gender in the form of gender identity means an imagined essence of womanhood, composed of insulting sex stereotypes about how women behave and think. But the inclusion of imagined identities into human rights documents and understandings threatens so much more. It threatens the ability to support equality and anti-discrimination on the grounds of race and disability too, as I will show. In the first decades after World War II, when the idea of human rights was adopted by the United Nations and enshrined in documents such as the Universal Declaration and the Conventions on Civil and Political Rights and on Social, Economic and Cultural Rights in 1966, it did seem as if there was a new dawn. In this new dawn, there would be an increasing acceptance internationally that all human beings had rights to dignity and respect. In the 1970s, the notion of rights was extended to explicitly include women in human rights understandings through the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. Feminist campaigners worked tirelessly and determinedly to get a recognition that women's rights are human rights, arguing that the original human rights framework was masculine, based upon a male template that did not cover women's experience. Feminists then worked to get the 1993 Declaration on Violence Against Women, which recognized that women suffer forms of violence and are forced into slavery in ways that men do not, such as battering and murder by men in the home and servile marriages. It was recognized that states that did not seek to outlaw these practices were involved in violations of women's rights. As a feminist political scientist, I have taught students about the concept of women's rights as human rights for several decades. I've used the idea of women's rights as human rights in my activist work with the Coalition Against Trafficking in Women in Australia and internationally. When I started teaching and writing about women's human rights in 1991, there was a general sense that the situation of women was improving. There had been a huge and influential feminist movement, although this was beginning to run out of steam. There was a sense of excitement and positivity in the feminist human rights community. Most of all, in the 1990s, feminists in law and political science in universities and on the ground were writing wonderful, inspiring work on how to expand women's rights practice and theory through including the rights of women. By the 2000s, however, the forward march of women's human rights was halted by the rise of religious fundamentalisms, which saw women's rights as a threat. The expansion in understanding of women's rights could not continue under the onslaught of organizing by conservative religious governments, such as the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the Vatican, as well as fundamentalist Christian churches in the US, which started to work seriously through the UN to impede the progress of women's rights. Women's rights, these religious entities said, were culturally specific or Western or an affront to God. The Commission on the Status of Women had changed, or gradually changed, from a site of opposition from men to a site of opposition from men instead of a triumphal site of progress for women. But at least the feminists were united in trying to preserve and protect women's rights. This changed in the last decade. The threats to women's rights more recently have taken a different form. The threat consists of identity politics, which argue that men who have fantasies about being members of rights-bearing categories other than their own should be entitled to rights based upon their make-believe. The majority of the men who campaigned for what they called the right to expression of gender were those who were called transvestites by the scientists of sex, i.e. men who were sexually excited by imitating women's oppression. They wanted to be able to dress as women in public places instead of secretly in the bedroom or at special clubs and weekends away that serviced their fetishistic sexual interests. From the 1990s onwards, transvestite campaigners sought to get their sexual excitements recognized as a human right. They argued that their interest had nothing to do with sex, although all sexologists before that time said that it certainly was, and their biographies, their pornography, and their websites make it very clear that it is sexual. They invented the idea that they really became women by some magical process by which sex stereotypes associated with women entered their brains and bodies. They gained what they called gender identities. As women, they said they should be entitled to all the hard-won rights of women, as well as special rights, which protected them in the performance of their fetishistic interests in public. There are those who designed and promoted the idea of gender identity rights for heterosexual male transvestites. The fiction they presented that people could change sex was disseminated to other groups who were greatly harmed by it, such as homosexual men who were unhappy loving men whilst remaining in their male bodies, and teenage girls who would once have grown up to be lesbians and now encouraged to believe that medical treatment that seriously and permanently damages health can make them boys. The women's human rights set out in CEDAW and the Declaration on Violence Against Women are based on biological sex and not gender. And by the 2000s, the language of gender as a euphemism for sex was already much in use in human rights work. It was therefore fairly easy for gender identity activists to inveigle themselves into what was referred to as gender and create determined confusion as to what gender actually meant. That would have been harder if the language of biological sex had been retained, because it is pretty obvious that men cannot change their biological sex. The gender identity campaigners piggybacked onto the issue of lesbian and gay rights in order to shove their fetish interests onto the human rights stage. Lesbian and gay rights were not included in any UN conventions because this would not have been acceptable to the very conservative and religious governments who were able to veto them. But lesbian and gay campaigners began to have increasing influence on human rights norms and in the creation of non-UN human rights documents. Through the avenue of increasing respect for lesbian and gay rights, the idea of rights for imagined make-believe identities gained entrance onto the human rights stage. The lesbian and gay organizations of the 1990s were dedicated to campaigning for the rights of lesbians, gays, and bisexuals, transvestites, men who are sexually excited by pretending to be women, a group which comprises around 70% of the men who engage in this form of make-believe, were not included. They began to wage a campaign to join the T for transgenderism up to the LGB because they understood that this was a way to get their fetishistic interests respected and given rights. For many years, they were held at bay. In the early 2000s, many gay male activists fought against joining up with the T. They said this would undermine their cause because transvestism was not about sexual orientation. But this opposition was overthrown, and gradually the gay organizations began to join the T into their names and into their areas of concern, until the point where heterosexual men with a sexual fetish for women's clothes came to be prominent in these influential organizations. One result was that when gay campaigning organizations created their own Yogyakarta principles in 2007 to put gay rights on the agenda, gender identity rights were front and center of the document. The effect was that at the same time as promoting lesbian and gay rights, lesbian feminists like myself, which lesbians and feminists like myself see as very important, the rights of men to enact their fantasies of being women in public space, which are hostile to women's rights, were included as if they were a vital part of a lesbian and gay platform. The once lesbian, gay, and gay organizations are now the conduit to the destruction of the category of women and potentially to the integrity of the concept of human rights itself. In the first few decades of human rights theory and practice, it was understood that rights-bearing categories were based upon material reality and not fantasy. The inclusion of men with a fetishistic fantasy life as a rights-bearing group caused the explosion and destruction of the category of women. But the damage to decades of human rights work and understandings caused by the inclusion of fantasists is not limited to the destruction of the category of women. The men who engage in this form of fantasy life eroticize inequality. They are masochists. They get excited from imitating groups of people who actually experience severe disadvantage or social disparagement for being women, Black, disabled, or children, for instance. Imitation of these categories of persons is exciting for some men because they luxuriate in the oppression of others. There are men who pretend to have disabilities for the purposes of sexual excitement. They are called trans-ableists, and men who are sexually excited by pretending to be babies and young girls, whose practice is called nappy fetishism or age regression. There are men who pretend to be of a different race, called transracialists, and men who pretend to be of a different species, called transspeciesists. These sexual paraphilias are often linked, and where a man has one of these, he is likely to have others too. There are women who engage in some of these practices, notably white women academics who pretend to be Black and gain prizes and academic rewards for their teaching of Black studies, such as Rachel Dolezal and Jessica Krug from the United States. Dolezal, when her impersonation was discovered, referred to herself as trans Black. Their interests are unlikely to be sexual, as the scientists of sex readily acknowledge that women are not fetishists. They do not engage in make-believe for sexual excitement as the men do. They have other motivations. Some men engage in transracialism too, and there are support groups for their activities. In cases such as that of a white man from the UK, Ollie London, who has had facial surgery to suit his identity as Korean and intends to reduce the size of his penis to more closely resemble a Korean penis, the motivation is likely to be sexual. In the case of trans-ableism, which is overwhelmingly an interest of men, motivation is sexual. This is paraphilia, which is often found in men with gender identity interests. Men with this sexual interest seek amputation of their legs or to have their spines broken. They may pretend to be both women and disabled and use a wheelchair in public to gain excitement, as does Chloe Jennings White from the US. The problem is that when men engaging in these pretend behaviors demand to be respected in human rights terms as belonging to the category they identify with, it makes those categories meaningless. Human rights understandings are based upon a materialist understanding of the world, not fantasy. It is hard to imagine how the human rights framework could have been built in the period after the World War II if men's sexual fantasies and make-believe had to be respected. But this was not the case. At that time, there was no attempt to respect or include men's fantasies. There have been very few voices raised to protest the way in which the play acting of sex stereotypes by men with a sexual paraphilia has become an issue of rights. One significant voice is that of Trevor Phillips in the UK. Phillips is a distinguished Black journalist who went on to head the Commission for Racial Equality and its successor organization, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. He wrote an article in the Times in 2018 in which he claimed that the notion of equality itself was at risk from gender identity. He said, "Trans extremists are putting equality at risk." He argued that allowing people to declare their own gender would make a mockery of Britain's decades-long struggle for fairness. It would, he argued, be the beginning of the end for the politics of equality in which he had been engaged for so long, because it would open up all rights-bearing categories to those who were acting out fantasies and therefore entirely discredit them. There is little public support for transracialism, and no powerful organizations demanding that men and women who play act being Black or an ethnicity that is not their own be included. There is almost universal condemnation of transracialism at this time. Rachel Dolezal's play acting of Blackness, for instance, was described in an article in the Huffington Post as messy theft and fiction of a Black American identity, which uses the currency of a subculture of privilege that is rooted in white supremacy. It says that to believe that one can transfer one's identity in this way is a privilege, perhaps the highest manifestation of white privilege. This understanding is not applied to the play acting of gender identity, however. In the media, there's almost universal approval and promotion of gender identity, with only some feminists making similar arguments, as in saying that when men pose as women, their practice is theft and privilege that is rooted in male supremacy. The difference between the ways in which gender and Black identity are viewed is likely to be the result of oppressions which affect men, such as racial discrimination, being seen as hugely more important than the oppression of women. Or it could be that gender identity is seen as real, whereas imitation of Blackness is obviously a fantasy. In a Guardian article, a white professor goes so far as to say that the conflation of transgender and transracial issues is dangerous. He does not make clear why that is so. Surely the behavior of transracialists and transableists cannot affect the politics of equality, you might say, because they're so outlandish. But the idea that people can change their sex, now more usually called gender, is changing the landscape of human rights and equality. The next Scottish census will allow people to choose their gender. This might encourage those with other paraphilias to register themselves as being Black or as disabled, when this is simply not true. White men and women who identify as Black or Aboriginal Australian have won accolades in the fields of literature, for instance. The idea of human rights is based upon material reality and cannot survive the addition of men's sexual fantasy identities. There are increasing threats to any global consensus on human rights at this time, such as the rise of authoritarian regimes. As human rights activists, we're already engaged in a struggle to maintain the gains that have been made. The most recent threat of the inclusion of men's imagined identities needs to be opposed with vigor if the seriousness of human rights is not to be devastatingly undermined. Thank you.